Professor Nancy Pearcey. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, an absolute pleasure. So you have recently here in the past couple years, written a book called The Toxic War on Masculinity, which you can find online if you would like to purchase that for yourself. I highly recommend it. I read it a little bit ago and very much enjoyed it. But the first question I want to ask about that topic is around the nature of the war and the origin of the war. Is the toxic war on masculinity a result of a toxic war on femininity that happened before?
Oh, I don't think I would put it that way. The toxic war on masculinity has a much deeper history than most people think. I mean, when I first started, I assumed it would be second wave feminism, 1960s.
Right.
And what I found is that it actually started with the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, men worked with their families, with their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the social expectation on men was much more oriented toward their caretaking role, responsibility for their family. And after the Industrial Revolution, well, what that did was it took work out of the home into
Yeah.
factories and offices, and men had to follow their work. And for the first time in American history, they were not working with their family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. Now, that's a very different work environment. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when we first start to see the literature change. I was shocked when I read the literature of the 19th century, and some of it was just as hostile as what we see today, because people began to complain that now that men were out of the home all day, they were losing their caretaking ethos. They were losing their connection with their families, and they were becoming egocentric and self-centered and making an idol out of their work, right? Getting their identity and their fulfillment from their jobs and their careers and their achievement instead of getting their identity from their family and their church. So actually, that's when, if you look back at the original documents of the time, that's when you start to see people protesting that men were changing. So it's much more deeply rooted than most of us realize.
Yeah, I think the average person kind of thinks, as you were saying, second wave feminism, the kind of earlier first and third wave feminism as well, and then like just recently, it feels like there's been an uptick in culture as far as the kind of vitriol towards men is concerned. But as far as the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't all bad because we did get some great things out of the Industrial Revolution, like the ability to mass produce goods and services that really do help people is a result of the Industrial Revolution. So how do you balance those two, and what should have been their way of integrating men into a different work environment?
Yeah, of course, the Industrial Revolution eliminated poverty, better than
Yeah.
anything else. So, um, but I would have loved to see people shape the workplace around the family needs. In other words, let me bring it up to our own day. During the
Hmm.
pandemic, a lot of men ended up working from home, and or part time or hybrid, remote work, and many of them discovered they actually liked being with their family more. In
Right.
fact, Harvard University did a study. This is not in my book because it was more recent, but they did a study, and the conclusion was during the pandemic, 68% of fathers said they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that.
Yeah.
So I would have liked to see, and I think we still can. We can work with the workplace, the scheduling, flexible hours, flexible place, working hybrid from home. I think we
Right.
could do a lot more flexibility to allow both parents, because mothers are working now too, to allow both parents to be more involved with their families. And the families would benefit. I think mothers and fathers would benefit as well.
Yeah, but it's not all bad that like there's a male competitive nature to the work environment, correct? Because I think some people like they hear this and they're like, fine, we'll just like homestead for the rest of our lives. But there is some like as someone who works in corporate myself, I very much enjoy the competitive nature of it. I don't have a wife and kids yet, but that's something that I am attracted to is like oh yeah, we're all on a team together and we're going to do something together, and then we get to do much more as a result of everyone, pitching their lot in, than we would individually.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I often got, having written this book, is, well, what do you think the differences are between men and women? All right, so I had to put that right at the beginning. And I had to say, well, let's start with just physical, because a lot of the differences build off the physical differences. Men are bigger, stronger, faster. They have more fast twitch muscles, which means they can react more quickly. They have 75% greater upper body muscle mass and 90% greater upper body strength. And because of testosterone, they do tend to be more risk-taking and aggressive. And these are just the creational givens. These are things that we have to learn to say these are good. Whatever God made men, this is intrinsically good. And yes, there's the fall and it can be distorted, but we have to start with creation. The breakdown: creation, fall, redemption.
Right.
You start with creation and say what God created is good. And I think that's where our culture is doing very poorly. They are not treating the basic masculine traits as intrinsically good.
Yeah.
And then, of course, women have children. And, women might get stronger, and compete with men athletically, but they'll never change the fact that women have children. And so that creates a lot of differences as well. On the one hand, it means that in every culture, men have done the more physical labor and warfare, things like that. And women have always done things that were more home-based that could be integrated with raising children. Because in pre-modern age, women spent much of their adult life pregnant, nursing, and babes in arms, and all three at once. So the sheer physical differences is the source of many of the differences between men and women, in terms of their work style and their lifestyle and even their temperament. Temperament, I love it. Jordan Peterson talks about this. He says, taking care of an infant changes your character. Because the infant's needs are non-negotiable. But if a baby cries, you don't reason with them, you don't scold them, you don't tell them, wait, I got to finish this first. You have to drop whatever you're doing and meet the baby's needs. And he's talked about how just that changes parents, but especially mothers, because they're the ones mostly involved with infant care. It changes their character. And so we have to look at these little basics and say, this is how God made us. This is good.
Right. And there's a story, there's a good after the Industrial Revolution, too. It's not like, there was the perfect ideal of Adam and Eve in the garden, and then now that we've got machines, it's like, oh, well, I guess we kind of abandoned that ideal. What is the right way for men and women to, their parts to harmonize and rhyme as they're trying to figure out their roles in the home and in the world?
Well, of course, some of this is individual. And because it's mostly anecdotal. I have lots of stories in my book about how, couples have, achieved a balance where 2/3 of women work at least part-time from home now. I was shocked when I read that. Most women, most of us have an education now and we want to use it, but we also want to be home with our children. And so the best middle ground there is to have some kind of part-time home-based work. And 2/3 of women do that, women home with children. And I talked a lot about men, too, in my book. I interviewed several couples. Men who did make sometimes difficult choices to pull back at work, to change work. If they had a very high-demand lawyer job, for example, they went into consulting, where they had more control over their schedule and could have more time with their kids. Or more flexible hours. I talked to a man who left work at 4 o'clock 3 days a week, just to coach his son's basketball and football teams. Yeah. By the way, his boss told him he was coasting and scolded him. But he said when his sons got older, they said, "We want to be a dad like you," which is much better than any workplace accolades. And I talked to some who actually worked all the way from home, One of my graduate students was married to an IT professional who came home during the pandemic, and he said, I didn't miss a beat, with the Zoom and everything. And because he was home, he was able to be more involved with homeschooling. He decided he would be the parent to make lunch every day. He was able to take his kids to sports. And in fact, he picked up so many of the parental obligations that his wife started a part-time business. And so the whole family benefited from the added income. But I interviewed him, and he said, first of all, our life is so much more balanced now. I'm never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle. Mm-hmm. And then he said, this is the best part, the time I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying with my wife.
Yes.
So I have anecdotes like that just to show people it is possible to have a better balance.
Yeah, it is. The balance is tricky because I think the world has told us, and maybe this is not just the world, but someone has been telling us that either you choose your career or your family, and you can't do big things in the world and also have a good family. And I just have a hard time believing that that's true. I don't think that God would, give us the dominion mandate and then say, well, you can't really do that much with the world. You just have to spend most of your time at home. And on the inverse, you can't do much at home. You need to be at the office 80 hours a week because that's the only way you do anything productive with your life. It's just a question of how do you balance the two, and how do you, is there a rubric that you use and have helped other people use for, hey, I'm prioritizing this too much or this too little, and here's why?
Well, just a historical perspective helps us. Anytime we have a contrast, it can help us, have a critical distance from our own situation. We have to realize that through the most of human history, men and women have both worked at home, because there always was home business. And so what we're experiencing now is a total anomaly within human history. Yeah. Men were able to work at home, but remember, women too. Women were involved in household manufacture. They were making buttons and candles and sewing clothes from scratch and canning food and feeding chickens. And so women were very much involved in productive, economically productive work. And so it's helpful for us to realize at least that this is not how God created it. When the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home, that was the first time there was this gap between being a parent and being a worker, and where that conflict began to appear, both for men and women. Insofar as feminism had some genuine causes, it was because women lost all that economically productive work. It was not just men's work taken out of the home, but women's work too, right? Preparing food and eventually even teaching your own kids. Very few families do that anymore. So the economic, the Proverbs 31 woman, right, who has all these businesses from home, that was taken away from women, and they were left with cleaning house, And so it was both men and women who were affected by this. It's just a physical split between work and home that we through most of human history, like millennia of human history, we didn't have to deal with. So that helps us to realize that this is not normative, and that we should try to find a solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would imagine part of the reason for the lack of split was because of the nature of the work before the Industrial Revolution. Majority of it was kind of was farming focused, and just planting crops so that you could eat next year and so that your village could eat next year. But then when a lot of that was kind of managed and taken care of, it's like, okay, well, what do we do now? Now we've got to invent something called marketing, and so people are kind of wondering, hey, what is the solution here, post-industrial revolution, to glorify God with how you work hard and do great things for the kingdom, but also how you do the most important thing, which is take care of your family and raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord.
Yes, well, the good thing about today is that knowledge workers, people who work with ideas and words and so on, consultants and writers and IT professionals, a lot of them have come home or work part-time from home. And some of my friends have said, "Oh yeah, well, you're just talking about the white collar workers. What about the rest?" Well, I do have a friend who owns a auto shop, and he doesn't bring cars home, but what he can do is he can bring his bookkeeping home, and that's what he does. So he leaves there instead of staying at the in the office. He brings his bookkeeping materials home, sits at the kitchen table while his kids are sitting around him doing their homework, so that he's there to interact with them, answer their questions, while they're doing homework. So even something blue collar like that, can be adjusted to some extent. If we have the ability, if we have the willingness, the motivation to do it. I think there's a lot of things that can be tweaked that we're just not using yet. Because I'll tell you what, our industrial society, the workplace was set up for essentially a single man. In other words, a man who could leave his family obligations behind because his
Right.
or either you single, or who could leave all of his family obligations behind because they had a home-based wife taking care of all that.
Right.
Well, women are now coming into the workforce and trying to fit into a structure that was designed for single men. So
Right.
that's why it is difficult. We should be thinking both parents, both wives, both fathers and mothers who want more time with their children. Is there a way to tweak the workplace and have more flexible hours, more flexible location, and so on?
Yeah. So in that way, was feminism a result of the Industrial Revolution, and also kind of its bane in the sense that it caused all the women to leave the homes, and then there's no one in the homes to take care of the children?
Yes, I do think that it's largely the Industrial Revolution because women saw like I said, they saw their traditional work was taken out of the home. Dorothy Sayers, I'm sure you know her, she argues that we're not traditional enough because if we were traditional, we would go back to Proverbs 31. We would go back to
Right.
women being able to have work in the home and have an economically productive role. That was a genuine loss in terms of variety and interest of work, and a genuine loss in status. Because when work started being done outside the home, that became the place of status. That's where the real work is done. That's where, the socially important work is done. So there was a
Right.
loss of status too. As you know, women at home are apologetic. I'm just a mom, I'm
Right.
just a
Yeah.
homemaker. So those genuine losses have to be acknowledged when we try to understand where feminism came from. And the trouble is, of course, what you just said. If women, fathers leave the home, and then if mothers leave the home, who takes care of the kids?
Exactly.
And that's where we are now. Who's going to really raise the children, like you said, in the admonition of the Lord and the love of the Lord?
Yeah. And the government has said, I can do that. And we're now saying, no, you can't. We're going to do that. We're going to do that ourselves. So did the Industrial Revolution, when the people who started the Industrial Revolution, I don't know quite how to phrase it, when those people were outlining this, were they trying, like, was this a malicious thing that they were trying to destroy the family, or was there something else that they were trying to do that maybe we could revert to because that would give us another look at it?
Yeah, well, what's so interesting is the Industrial Revolution was largely sparked by Christianity. First, it was the scientific revolution, right? And the scientific revolution science depends on two major assumptions. The world has a rational order, and that the human mind is capable of knowing that. And Christianity gave us those two assumptions. The world is rational, has a rational order because it was created by a rational mind, a God, and He created us in His image, so that we also think in a sense like God. As Kepler said, you've probably heard this phrase, the early scientists said we wanted to think God's thoughts after Him. And that was particularly Kepler. He said, because we were made in God's image to think the way God does. But then the next step was the Industrial Revolution. The scientific revolution gives rise to the Industrial Revolution. And there are even non-Christian scientists who say it was driven by a Christian vision of making labor easier, because part of the fall, right, was God said, your labor, I will increase your labor and it will be difficult and tedious, oppressive in a way that it wasn't before the fall. And
Yeah.
so people began, it was driven by a Christian social vision that said, if there's a type of movement that's so monotonous and so, difficult that it's not worthy of a child of God. There's a secular historian who actually puts it that way, that people sought to invent a machine when the work was so tedious and difficult and degrading that it was not worthy of a son of God. I love that. It's a non-Christian saying this. And so,
Right.
so even the technology its original vision was very much driven by a Christian understanding, first of the science that made it possible, and then of the idea of social amelioration, helping people overcome the fall, overcome the effects of the fall using
Right.
machines. Now, where they made a mistake, I think, was once the Industrial Revolution got underway. I have talked to so many Christians who tell me today the workplace treats the family as competition.
Yes.
They want the workers' primary allegiance. They want the primary loyalty to be to the workplace, and that's wrong. The workplace should not have that expectation. They should be saying, no, your family is first, and the workplace is second. So I've talked to so many people Christians who are struggling with this. How do I have a better balance? And they run into this mentality in the workplace that work comes first. And if it doesn't, you're not committed enough.
Yeah. Right.
So now we do have that mentality that we have to counter.
Yeah. How did we get from the point where we're trying to not have humans do work that degrades the image of God, to where we are now? Because it seems like there's something happened that's not just people got taken out of the home, but like now we're dealing with people like Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes, and that feels like a strange and unforeseen circumstance given the Industrial Revolution.
Secularization. That's the answer is America became more secular. It was happening about the same time. As work was taken out of the home, there developed a large public sphere that didn't exist before, consisting of large public institutions, from factories and businesses to financial institutions to universities to the state. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should operate by what they called scientific principles. But what they really meant was value-free.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. So that's when the public realm began to be, sort of stripped of a Christian worldview, of Christian values and morality. And of course, this is part of the back to the masculine script, the script for men. It was men who were working in that secularized arena and getting that secularized education. And so they became secular earlier than women did. And this was also part of the tension historically between men and women. In the 19th century, which is when the secularization was taking place, well, there was a great rise in sort of the traditional male vices like drinking and gambling and prostitution and fighting and crime. And so the 19th century was also an era of great reform movements to try to counter that. And many of those reform movements were driven by women because, women didn't work yet. So
Right.
how could they have a good effect on society? Well, they could join these reform movements.
Yeah.
And it developed quite a tension between men and women because in a sense, women were trying to say, we want to re-Christianize the public sphere.
Yes.
But the people who were the object of their reform movements were mostly men. Mm-hmm. And so most people don't, when you read typical secular histories, they don't talk about that dimension. But there really was a sexual tension as well, as women tried to, in a sense, let me give you an example. The temperance movement. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today.
Okay, grief. Drinking like the Irish.
Sometimes a single fact can kind of, crystallize it. So there was a reason there was a temperance movement.
Yeah.
But the temperance movement was primarily women trying to bring their husbands home from the taverns and the saloons back to the family hearth where they belonged.
Right.
So a lot of the tension that we still see between men and women was started there as well, because women were trying to get men to behave better.
Yeah.
I'm using the exact words from one historian of the time. She said most of the reform movements were trying to get men to behave.
I don't blame them. That's a bit of a rough situation, and I would imagine that that's part of the reason that obviously feminism came from that, but then the feminist hatred of the hatred of men as like a inferior species, almost like there's a strange and unusual account on Twitter that every day just posts a picture from this woman's music video, and the caption is just "Hey men, and they're just pigs," and that feels like a downstream effect from that is they looked at the men drunk in the taverns 6 nights out of 7, and they're like, oh. Yeah, it makes sense to draw the conclusion that men are just kind of less spiritual, more belly, more bestial beasts.
Yes, I appreciate that, because this is when the churches began to appeal to women. This is when the churches began to say, oh, women are more spiritual. Women are more morally sensitive. And instead of appealing to men as the head of the household, which they had traditionally done,
Right.
they shifted their message and began to appeal to women and started to try to persuade women to be the means of converting their worldly husbands. And I think that was a terrible mistake. And I think, well, when I talk to Christian men today, they say, oh, yeah, that's still the message in the church. That like you just said, men are more naturally prone to sin and vice, that women are more naturally moral, the double standard there.
Yeah.
Which I think is terribly destructive. So I'll give you one example. I had a graduate student who was the head of the women's ministry at a very large megachurch here in Houston. And she said during the planning sessions for the year, on Mother's Day, they would hand out roses and tell the women they're wonderful. And on Father's Day, they would scold the men and tell them to do better. And so when I was writing my book, I was very careful not to have a scolding tone. I thought, this is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to encourage men who are doing well. And by the way, that's a big part of the book we haven't touched on yet. But I do talk about some sociological studies that show that Christian men, men who are evangelical Christians and sincere about it, attending church regularly, do test out in studies as being the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers.
Yeah.
So this is the message the church should be sending. It should be affirming and encouraging men that they are doing well. When they follow God's design, they do have better marriages and happier families.
Yeah. Why has the church abandoned that?
Well, yes, I think it was during that period when men were becoming secular. I mean, even, again, secular historians talk about this. I have a quote from a secular historian who said, it was men who were attending the secularized universities. So their mentality, they were becoming less and less attached to the church. Their religious convictions and commitments were becoming weaker. And so, and this was especially in the first and second Great Awakening, because in America, a lot of our evangelicalism comes out of the two awakenings. And again, what most historians don't mention is that the majority of conversions were young women during the yes. See, people don't know this.
Yeah.
But yes, the in terms of sheer numbers, the majority of the conversions were young women. And what happened is, at this time there were not a lot of atheists. And so the appeal was not sort of intellectual and apologetics, giving intellectual arguments for Christianity. Most people were Christian, at least in background, but their problem was that they were lukewarm, they were indifferent, they were complacent, they didn't care much. Yeah. And so the message of the first and second Great Awakenings tended to focus on arousing people emotionally, revving up their devotional motivation to it was very much geared towards almost redefining conversion as an intense emotional conversion experience very
Yeah.
experiential. And so so the good part of the awakenings is it's the main reason America remains the most religious of the industrial nations. The bad part, the sort of negative baggage, was it tended to redefine Christianity in terms of emotional experience and to downplay theology and doctrine and the whole cognitive side of belief. And so that was another reason. If you redefine Christianity as emotion, and stereotypically it's women who are more emotional,
Yep.
then it seems natural that women are more spiritual. And
Yeah.
that's the message preachers began to give at that time, is women are more naturally spiritual. And so, they've got to drag their husbands along.
Yeah, no, it is really sad, and I think that's part of the reason why sometimes men go to the Catholic churches or the Eastern Orthodox churches is because there it's even in its appearance, it's more logical and firm and steady. Obviously, the theology is wrong, but there is the appearance of steadiness, of groundedness, and which is kind of a rebellion from the emotive pyrotechnics, smoke, lights everywhere that you see in a lot of the mega churches, unfortunately. So it's I get where you're coming from, and it's a sad plight to see. As far as the church's messaging towards men, though, why is it that the church has kind of always been so negative towards men and positive towards women, even in how they handle and go about dealing with sin?
Yes, again, historically, if men became secular earlier than women did, because they were in the public square, and the public square was being secularized, and in fact, well, like today, people began to say, don't bring your private values, don't bring your Christian perspective in the public square. And so even if you wanted to, you were pushed back. As you know, even today, you might even lose your job if you try to
Yeah.
bring a Christian
Oh, yeah.
perspective into the public square. So,
My dad did.
oh, did he?
There you go. Yeah. No, he was short story. I'll keep it brief. So he started a company and ran it for like 19 years and got it to a very successful, very profitable company. And then they got bought out. And this was like 2020, 2022. And they were like, yeah, you have to put that little black square in your LinkedIn bio for George Floyd. And he was like, no, not going to do that. And so they fired him as the CEO. And there's a lot of uproar. We've been fine. He started a new company, which is wonderful. And God only writes good stories. But that's a real, people who are saying that isn't happening. It very much is happening.
It is. It is. And so men are under much more pressure to hide their Christian convictions, to not live them out, and then that becomes sort of the expectation to be a real man.
Yeah.
You asked me one question, and you sent the questions ahead of time, and the real man versus the good man. And
Yeah.
this was from a sociological study. A sociologist is so well known that he speaks all around the world, and so he came up with an ingenious experiment where he'd ask young men in particular 2 questions. First, he would say, what does it mean to be a good man? You're at a funeral, and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? And the young men all around the world had no trouble answering. Immediately, they would start listing things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing,
Right.
look out for the little guy, be responsible, be generous. And the sociologists would say, where'd you get that? And they would just say, I don't know. It's in the air we breathe.
Yeah.
To which I would say, they're made in God's image. And
Right.
they do know what it means to use their unique masculine strengths for good. It's stamped in them, with the image of God. But then the sociologist would ask them a second question. He would say, what does it mean to you if I say, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs,
Yeah.
play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid, using their language there. And so the sociologist said, men seem to be sort of trapped between these 2 opposing scripts, that they do inherently know what it means to be a good man, which I think is very encouraging, by the way, because this was global.
Yeah.
It was not just in countries that had a Christian background. So that's encouraging. It
Yeah.
is there. But he said, so in many cultures, they also have a competing script of what it means to be masculine, which is the more secular version. And not that it's all bad. We want people to hang tough in a crisis. But if it gets separated from a moral vision, of course, it can degrade into misogyny and entitlement and dominance and so on. The Andrew Tate phenomenon, as you
Right.
mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So I think what this means is, as Christians, stop scolding the Andrew Tate side, and and be confident that in the heart of hearts, men do know what it means to be a good man,
Yeah.
and see if you can tap into that and support it and affirm it and encourage it, because it really is there. And that's what I think the church should be doing, is affirming the image of God in men, being confident that it's there so that you can approach them in a much more positive way.
Did he ask that same question to women? What's the difference between a good woman and a real woman?
He wasn't studying women. This is this is a sociologist who's written several books on men. That has been his
Okay.
field of study.
Okay. I would be fascinated to see, because at least from my perspective, but talk as a guy talking to guys, like guys know there's right things to do and wrong things to do, and like part of it is in our nature, like, oh yeah, we should protect and defend. And I don't know where I got that from, but I do know that that's in me, like I should protect and defend. But also, there are aspects of the real man that appeal, and some aspects which rightly appeal. Like we do want to be ambitious and go do things, and I'm not opposed to getting rich and finding a wife and things like that. So it's hard, kind of the best lies have a little bit of truth in them, and I think that's part of the trick with the real man narrative, is that there is a little bit of truth in there.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I think that as Christians, what we want to do is to encourage the good parts. It's never as effective to try to scold someone out of bad behavior.
Right.
There's a psychotherapist who wrote the first book on male depression, so he's kind of an expert on male psychology. And he said the way you do it is you show that you see the good side. Oh, here's another sociological study. It's shorter. Excuse me, not it was an anthropologist, not a sociologist. An anthropologist did the first cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. The ideals for masculinity.
Yeah.
And of course, there's differences in different cultures. But amazingly, he found that there's a common core. Again, similar, a common core of what it means to be a good man across all cultures. And he calls it the 3 Ps. That the good man is the one who will provide, protect, and procreate, meaning become a father,
Right.
build into the next generation. Provide, protect, and procreate. And again, this is not a Christian anthropologist. But once again, it tells us as Christians that we can be confident that when we talk to men, they do have that core inner knowledge, that innate, universal knowledge of what God has called them to be. And so we can tap into that. The guy who wrote the book on male depression, he said, the way I deal with even men who are doing pretty poorly in their marriage, he specializes in very troubled marriages. And he says, the way I do it is I tell the man, I know you're a good man. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. So I know you're a good man. Now, would you like me to help you see where you're shooting yourself in the foot?
Right.
And, he aligns himself with the good man part and then helps him deal with parts where he's destroying his marriage.
Yeah. Right.
But he aligns himself first with the good part. And I think that's a great strategy.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that part of the reason that guys are struggling with this too, and I'll speak here specifically about married guys and guys in relationships, is I think part of the use of a woman, I'm using the Bible's term here, is women are great at encouraging and building up. And, when you're going through a hard time, like, hey, you can do this thing. I really respect that you're getting up every morning and doing the hard thing regardless. And so as guys have kind of separated themselves from women as an act of of fear sometimes that the women are going to pull them down and destroy their lives and careers, I think they're losing something really valuable as it relates to their encouragement and their betterment as men.
Yes, in fact, let's come back to the sociological studies of Christian men. Let me give you a few stats on that. So, of course, the media narrative is that evangelical men are the worst,
Right.
the most abusive, exhibit A of toxic masculinity. And so the social scientists were listening to this and saying, well, you're making these accusations, but where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they did the studies, and that's, I suppose, a good part of the fact that Christians were targeted is they got studied. And so what they found is evangelical Christian men who are sincere and practicing in their faith. Number one, the wives test out as the happiest. The wives test out, they do interview the wives separately. So the wives test out as being happiest with the way their husbands treat them. They spend more time with their children than secular men, 3.5 hours more per week than secular men. They have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples, which is significant.
Yeah.
And then, to everyone's shock, they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America.
Wouldn't you know?
Surprise, surprise. So the sociologist who did the largest study is at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he writes for places like the New York Times. And so let me give you a quote. A quote from the New York Times. Here's what his name is Brad Wilcox. And he says, it turns out that the happiest wives in all America are religious conservatives. Fully 67. Oh, shoot. I haven't looked at my numbers. I think it's 67. No, 73. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. So this is, not a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical research.
Yeah.
And we should be confident bringing it into the church and into the public square as well.
Yeah. No, I think that once we've restored the, Doug Wilson, my pastor, has a saying that you can't make a good omelet with bad eggs. Once we restore the men and the women and renew their hearts, I think that we'll start to see a lot of things clear up that we didn't really know were downstream effects from what we're fighting here. And it sounds like part of what we're fighting is feminism, but really just what we're fighting is the sin as old as sin, which is just secularism and wanting to do it our own way.
Yes, in fact, the first pushback I get, always, is, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? In fact, in my research, I found that was one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. And so the researchers actually went back to the data, and they made a very important distinction between men who are committed and authentic and nominal Christians. My students don't know what nominal means, so I have to tell them NOM is Latin for name. So it means Christian in name only. And so these are men who, on a survey like this, might check, say, the Baptist box, but who actually attend church rarely, if at all. And they test out dramatically different. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their kids. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular couples. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular couples. So here's what we're up against in the church. We have these really committed men who do better than the rest of the culture. And we have these men who are identifying as evangelical, but who test out as worse even than secular men. And so how do we encourage the men who are doing well, and how do we reach out and disciple the nominals, and bring them in? And basically what they're doing is they're hanging around the fringes of the Christian world enough to pick up the language of headship and submission. But then they're infusing it with meanings from the secular world, from the Andrew Tates of the world. They're taking the meaning from the secular world. And so they're And by the way, they're also ruining the reputation of Christians, right? Because when
Yes,
people
they
run
are.
into them, they
Yeah,
think, "Oh,
right?
look at these evangelicals."
I know, right?
So
A real handful.
yeah, so that's why we have a negative reputation a lot. But anyway, the point is, we have solid empirical research now. And by the way, that's one reason I wrote the book. Is because I kind of stumbled on this research, and I thought,
Yeah,
this isn't in the church yet. Christians
right.
don't know this. So
Yeah.
I wrote the book to try to get Christians to talking about the actual research showing that Christian men are doing so well.
Yeah. No, and it's done a great job of that. I mean, it's been encouraging for me also to kind of look out and see my generation. And like 75% of the guys in my generation want to get married. And I believe I pulled up the numbers, and yeah, over 85% of Republican men want to return to traditional gender roles, and over 80% of Republican women agree with them that that's, where we should be getting back to. And so, we haven't quite tied the tradition to the God of the Bible, which is what made the tradition so, worth having around. But we are on the right path, and I would imagine part of that is probably just a reaction from seeing their parents and grandparents go through such hell.
Yes, and what's really tragic is that there was a study, a graph that was posted just today on Twitter from Gallup, and it was from 2020, to today, 2025, 2026 now, and it shows men being conservative. This was just men and women. It wasn't even Republican men, but men tended to be sort of on the conservative side and not changing very much from 20 to 26. Women went way up in terms of being
Really?
far more leftist. Yeah, so there was in 2020 the difference between men and women was a 12% difference.
Yeah.
Now it's 23% difference, and it's not men who moved. It's women who moved. It's women who became more leftist.
Man. Sounds like we need to engage them next. I think the guys have had a lot of attention as we have kind of been demoralized very publicly. And I'll add the way that guys sin is generally super public too. We're the ones who go out and do a bunch of cocaine and buy a bunch of hookers. That's a pretty public sin, right? And that's kind of where guys, because of the nature of our bodies, are just more drawn to intrinsically. So yeah, there's a toxic war on masculinity, and it sounds like there needs to be some sort of war on the toxic femininity. But is there a healthy way to go about both of those things in such a way that we do actually not push people over the edge into the extreme ditches?
Well, one thing I do deal with in the toxic war on masculinity is I do have 2 chapters on abuse. Because nominal Christian men have higher rates of abuse than even secular men, I had to deal with it.
Wow.
It would look like I was, shoving it under the carpet. So I do,
Yeah.
and that is a major reason why women radicalize, why they go leftist, is
Yeah.
if they're in any sort of abusive relationship with a man and they become disillusioned and angry and hurt.
Oh, yeah.
My own story. I start the book with my own story because my father was abusive, and
Oh,
I
wow.
decided,
I'm sorry.
yeah, it's in the foreword of the book.
Yeah.
He was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. He was punching us, and kicking us, and we children all had a lot of psychological and spiritual healing we had to go through. But of course, as a young adult, I ricocheted off into extreme feminism because I had a very negative view of men, because of my father. And so I just ate up these books on feminism. I thought they were great and got angrier and angrier as I read them because they all have such an angry tone. And then, of course, I became a Christian and had to start over again and rethink this whole question.
How did that transition happen? Because there's most likely a lot of women who are going to have to do the same thing as yourself. How did you manage to go from radical feminist to, here having written many books on the radical Christianity?
I have to tell you, I remember the exact day.
Wow.
We lived a block from a library, so I got to read every feminist book on the shelves. And then I was reading a book by Nancy Friday. She was sort of a secondary feminist, not quite up there with Betty Friedan, but Nancy Friday, and it was called My Mother, Myself. And she was showing how every problem in her life was her mother's fault. If she had problem A, it was her mother's fault, and if she had the opposite problem Z, it was her mother's fault. And about halfway through, I literally thought, I'm tired of being a victim. That phrase came to my mind. I am tired of being a victim. She never takes any accountability herself. It's always somebody else's fault. And I'm tired of that.
Yeah.
That was the day I closed the book. I didn't finish reading it. I closed the book and said, I'm not going to call myself a feminist anymore. And then, of course, in the 70s, feminism became very closely aligned to just abortion and lesbianism. So if you said I was a feminist, if you told someone you were a feminist, they kind of assumed you were pro-abortion and probably lesbian.
Yeah, right.
So that was another reason, it no longer communicated something that I would want to identify with. But that was the turning point. And today, that might be even more relevant because with critical theory is Marxist, and it's all about oppressors and the oppressed.
Yep.
The victim mentality is everywhere now. And maybe some people will start to realize that's not empowering, to always identify as a victim. Eventually you have to say, I can change things. I don't have to, I don't have to be at the whim, at the mercy of external forces. I can change my life.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we're seeing that victim mentality in the Christian circles, in the Republican and the right circles, as well as the left circles. Everyone just feels that they're being oppressed by various groups all the time, and no one has any solutions as to what we should all do about it. So, Lord willing, we will remember the promises of the Bible and go from there. As far as reaching out to feminists, how should we encourage them? You've made a good point that we should be encouraging men not to go down the toxic masculinity route because, appeal to their basest instinct, which is to do the right thing, to provide, to protect, and to, find a wife and procreate. How should we be appealing to women who are in the radical feminist category?
I would think especially the most radical ones have some kind of history like mine, some kind of history of trauma. And dealing with the trauma is probably an important starting point. When I became a Christian, I don't know if you know this, I became a Christian through L'Abri, which is the ministry of Francis Schaeffer.
Yes.
And, he is known for having come up with cultural apologetics, so it's a little different.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I went to L'Abri. I went to L'Abri as a non-Christian, and I became a Christian there. And what was interesting, and I never used to include this in my testimony, I would just talk about the intellectual conversion, because I had absorbed secular ideas and had to work through a lot of secular isms to become a Christian. But what I have started telling people now is there's another side to it, and that is that at L'Abri there was a psychiatric social worker. And she had agreed to be on staff because she realized that for a lot of people, their barriers to Christianity were not just intellectual, but also emotional. And especially if you'd had difficult relationship with the parents, and especially pastors' kids and missionary kids. And she was a missionary kid. And so her name was Sheila Bird. We called her Birdie. And Birdie, the reason I went to L'Abri, people ask me, why would you go if you're not a Christian? Why go to a Christian place? The reason I went is because I had some relatives passing through. Excuse me, I should say, I was in Germany going to school. The background here, I was in Germany, and I had some family members going through L'Abri, and they said, come and see us.
Yeah.
And it was my parents. So Birdie saw my dad. And she told me later, she said, I looked at your dad and I said, there is a man who oppresses everyone around him. She could see. And so Birdie, remember, she's the psychiatric social worker. She was the one who helped me start with emotional, spiritual, psychological healing from my father, from the trauma of having a very abusive childhood. So right from the beginning of my Christian life, I had the intellectual side, which is unusual. Not everyone gets that. But I also had a very rich personal relationship with God that was very healing. Really learning to experience God's love in a way that heals all of the emotional wounds, that you bring with you from your childhood. And that's what with an awful lot of women, especially if they're more radicalized, it's often because they've had some negative trauma, some kind of physical or sexual abuse. And I think approaching them on that level of God can heal your trauma, God can heal your emotional wounds, I think it's important for a lot of women.
Yeah. I think women need a rock, a sturdy thing to attach to. And because their fathers weren't that, they kind of have a distant view of all men. And so reminding them, encouraging them that Christ is the rock, and then hopefully bringing them in so that they can find a good man who can be their rock. I think that's kind of the best we can do. For both genders, as they're thinking about, and I know you got to go here, what is the right way to both in this post-industrial age to both prioritize the home and remember that the home is the important thing, but also prioritize and remember that God also gave us the command to subdue the earth and have dominion over it, and preach the gospel to all nations. What's the right way to be thinking about those two things together? How do they mesh? And what should they be watching for? What should they be looking for in themselves that they're prioritizing one thing over another?
I'll go back to the cultural mandate. Not all Christians know that term. The cultural mandate is in Genesis, where God has, created the universe, he's created the animals, and then he finally creates the first human couple. And what is the first thing he says to them? He tells them why he made them. What's their job description? What's their purpose? Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And in the streamlined language of Genesis 1, we can unpack many layers of meaning, because be fruitful and multiply doesn't just mean have a family, but anthropologists tell us that all the social institutions grow out of the family. Right? It becomes an extended family, a clan, a tribe, a nation, and you need social groups for particular things. You need a government, you need a school, you need a church, you need a marketplace. And so it really means develop the entire social world. And then subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So again, most cultures, like you said earlier, start with agriculture, and then they go to mining and technology and designing computers and composing music. And one of my students said, "Oh, come on, composing music." And I said, "I play the violin." What's the violin made out of? Wood.
Wood, right?
And bow, horsehair. So I said, all the transcendent beauty we associate with music starts with harnessing the natural resources that God has put into creation. So I think that gives us a really good balance, because it's the social world, and then it's the hands-on, the technology, the industry. Wait, a friend of mine just, who used to work at Labrie, in fact, just gave me labels. He said it's the social mandate and it's the entrepreneurial mandate. Isn't that a great label? The social mandate.
That's a wonderful way of thinking about it.
And the entrepreneurial mandate. So yeah, I'm going to use those labels now. I just talked to a friend who gave me those, and I think maybe that will help us keep the balance. The cultural mandate had both equally.
Yeah. No, I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about entrepreneurial and social, because a lot of Christians kind of fall into the okay, fine, we'll retire to a homestead, which is just a strange and odd form of apathy, where they're not really wanting to engage with the world. And then a lot of non-Christians, and unfortunately some Christians too, only engage with the secular world, the work world, the entrepreneurial world, and they see their meaning and their value and their being as coming from that, as opposed to coming from Christ through the home and then to the rest of the world. I did a piece today, actually, I posted it on Substack, about how all things come through Christ through the home and spill out into the rest of the world. But that's how God loves to work, and that's how God loves to conquer the world. So we ought to be obeying him there.
Love it. I love that, yeah. I love the centrality of the home.
Yes, it's wonderful. Where can people find you online and the Toxic War on Masculinity and other books that you've written, all of these things, if they want, as they should, to learn more?
So I do have a website that my publisher updated, so it's colorful.
Wonderful.
NancyPearcey.com. Nancy Pearcey, and that's Pearcey. Don't forget the second E.
distinction.
NancyPearcey.com. So you can come and kind of peruse all of my books that way. I mean, of course, they're all on Amazon. So you can also go to Amazon. It's easiest if you just look up the author page, and you can see them all that way.
Fantastic. And you are on Twitter as well, and perhaps other social media?
I'm mostly on Twitter. I've gotten sort of back into Facebook. Facebook is so much slower that I got off it for a while.
Yeah, right?
Because Twitter is such a good way to stay up on current events. And as a
Yes.
Christian, I think you should do that. You should
Yes,
stay
you should.
informed. So yes, come over on Twitter too. Say hello.
Yeah. Follow her on Twitter. She's got some, you continue to write and do great things. So we'd highly recommend people to check those out. And I will put links in the description for all of those. Professor Pearcey,
Thank you.
thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
It was fun talking with you. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the audience that you're reaching out to.
Yeah. Thank you so much. See you guys.